Like-minded. Written by Radar 1388. We have a bond, remember? At the time when Robin said this, neither of them knew just how literal that was. Collection of one-shots that take place right after the end, Part 3. It follows the eventual romance between Raven and Robin, as well as a bond that neither of them expected. You can consider these one-shots to be chapters as they'll interconnect into Season 5. However, you can also read them all as standalones, unless otherwise specified. Also, I do something called one-word one-shots, meaning if you give me a single word, I'll turn it into a one-shot. Hope you'll enjoy. Constructive criticism is always welcome. Light. Trigon had been defeated. Her father no longer had any hold over her. She was finally free, or at least she should be. Azeroth, Mithryon, Zintas. She whispered tensely, eyes closed and levitating a few inches above her bed. She would have preferred to do so over her meditating circle, but she was tired, confused, and wanted something soft to land on should she lose focus. Her three-word chant was once a peaceful and safe repetition. It now felt like a burden, a necessity that should that she should that she had expected to overcome but couldn't. She gave a frustrated huff and gritted her teeth. Somewhere in a corner of her room, a jar holding one of her many candles exploded. The glass shards pierced the wax to pieces, sending it all crumbling to the floor. Wincing, Raven cracked an eye open. Thankfully, the candle was unlit. Cleaning up glass and wax was one thing, but cleaning up and repairing fire damage was another. She would clean up the remains and buy a new one once she centered herself. Sighing harshly through her nose, she closed her eyes again. Forcing herself to relax clearly wasn't working, and her chant wasn't currently soothing. Instead of focusing on words of thoughts, she tried focusing on her senses instead. The stillness of her room, the scent of of the midnight air coming in through a cracked window, the breeze that brushed over her aching muscles. Inhaling more deeply, she focused on that. She tried to let her mind rest and to allow her body to start healing itself. Her shift in focus worked as well as it could have. Her mind now felt nearly neutral, and she could feel her energy ghosting purposefully through her nerve endings. There would be no immediate change. Her body was exhausted to quickly heal any bruises, stiffness, or fatigue. The next few days she would more than likely spend in her room, resting and meditating. She drifted down and didn't open her eyes until she felt her comforter beneath her. She now chose to stare at one of her walls, seemingly at nothing in particular, definitely not ignoring anything. The broken candle would beg to differ, as she could practically feel it glaring at her from its shattered position on the floor. Quickly, she turned her attention away from her room and the candle, and raised one of her hands. She willed her magic to her fingertips. The familiar darkness encased her, dancing and swirling over her skin, waiting to be commanded. She let it flicker and fade away as her hand fell onto her lap. With a small irate growl, she shook her head resignedly. She swung her legs off the bed and made her way across the room to finally face the matter. She inspected the remains, trying to discern what brand it was to eventually get a replacement, and now fading magic, and would have to be remade from scratch should she want to use it again. She levitated the glass and waxed into the small garbage bin near her vanity. She hadn't used that particular candle in ages. If the time came where she wanted to use it, she would remake it then. Still, she couldn't help but stare desperately at the pin. It made no sense. She was expecting her powers to feel more balanced, more in control. However, there was no change whatsoever. Nothing worse, nothing better. They were still as volatile as they ever were. She knew she could handle it. Of course, nothing had changed, which meant maintaining her powers would still be routine. However, she had hoped for more control, to feel more ease of mind, to feel more ease of mind that she wouldn't accidentally destroy her or hurt anything. She had hoped that now that the apocalypse was over, things would be different. She sighed, ga- gave the pen a final look, and returned to her bed. Her hopes were clearly dashed. Robin stared at the ceiling. He should be sleeping like a rock, but for some reason he was tense. He tossed and turned for what felt like hours. Finally, he kicked the covers away, got up, and left his room. He didn't bother to Turn on any lights. The tower was dark and silent, but not stifling. It was another calm night. A stark, a stark contrast to the dark day they'd all had. During the times when Robin couldn't sleep for whatever reason, he took a walk through the tower. The tower. He told himself it was to get in to get in a last little bit of exercise before calling it night. While that was practically true, it was mostly to give himself peace of mind, to know that their home was safe, though it was unnecessary unnecessary more often than not. Raven saved the entire world. She turned everything back to normal. He doubted that there was a hair out of place anywhere. Still, it was routine on nights like this to do a sweep of everything, to ensure all was well. It wasn't a trust issue at all. Quite the contrary. She was one of the most trustworthy people he knew. It was just a habit it developed over the years. Plus, it might have helped him to get to the bottom of this uneasy feeling. He he eventually made his way to the living room to inspect one of the room one of the towers one of the tower's many pin pads on the wall. He nodded once, assured that their security system currently displayed no faults, and walked out into the hallway. Eventually, he was approaching a bend that would lead to one of his teammates' bedrooms. Raven's. He crossed his arms, feeling the tension go in and out like a wave. Tumultuous. He stopped, shook his head, and turned around. He made his way to the evidence room, and did his usual tally to make sure every item was accounted for. He would now have to do the same for the boxes they stored in the basement, Once again, he almost passed Raven's room, as that would be the fastest route. Instead, he went down a corridor and turned, essentially making a wide U to avoid her part of the tower. Raven was apathetic, apathetic, though she didn't make a habit of purposefully reading others' emotions. Robin didn't want to accidentally disturb her. He didn't know why he was feeling so tense, and he didn't want Raven to pick up on that, to pick up on it and wake up. Tonight, out of all of them, Raven was the one who needed rest the most. After doing a count of their storage boxes and finding nothing out of place, he sat up. He sat on the basement stairs. The tended to be the quietest place in the tower besides the rooftop. It was sometimes the perfect place to think. He sat there, trying to make sense of his thoughts. No, not his thoughts. His mind felt rather calm, but he felt physically uptight, and he still couldn't explain why. A a dull clanking echoed when he gripped the metal handrail to haul himself back to his feet. He walked back up the steps and shut the door behind him. Now that he'd made his rounds, maybe he could get some sleep. And maybe sleep would get rid of this feeling. He was cracking his knuckles and flexing his shoulders in an effort to work out the tension when he realized where he was. He stopped right in front of Raven's door. How did he keep ending up to here tonight? He flashed the door an apologetic look and was about to swiftly turn away when he heard shuffling coming from within. His brows scrunched. It was normal for him to be without sleep on a regular basis, but not his teammates, especially Raven, especially tonight. He raised his fist, then lowered it. It was doubtful that she'd want to be disturbed. However, when he heard what sounded like glass being shuffled around, followed by silence, his concern grew and the anxiety he'd be he'd been feeling all night grew stronger as well. He raised his fist and knocked. For a few seconds there was nothing but more silence. Then Raven's door slid open, not just a crack like normal, but all the way. He immediately noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the slight sag in her shoulders. She also wasn't wearing her cloak, just her leotard, which was once again black instead of white, and her hair once again trimmed. What? Raven asked. Robin's brow rose slightly. The tone in that singular word didn't have its usual antisocial bite, nor could it be considered soft. It was simply a question. Look, he rubbed the back of his neck, trying to figure out where to start. I know it's been one hell of a day. He mentally scolded himself at the unintentional pun, and you probably don't want to see anyone, but I just, well, I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Raven tilted her head curiously. Would just be Trigon. I'm finally free of him. Why wouldn't I be okay? Robin couldn't help but analyze her tone again. She wasn't being short with him. She, she sounded calm and neutral, with a hint of exhaustion tied in. She was clearly tired, but not at all annoyed. Right, yeah, sorry, he said quietly. He gave her a small smile. Good night, Ray. He started to turn away. Couldn't sleep. He swiveled, he swiveled to face her again. He sighed. Not a wink. Me neither. Raven shook her head. She glanced out into the hallway. Midnight Star? What do you guess? When you're on one of your moods, you always praise the tower. You're not always quiet about it. She said with a half smirk. So what is it this time? Her smirk fell. It's about today, isn't it? He shook his head. Actually, no. It may be part of it, I guess, but that's not it. Raven sighed silently. Though everything turned out okay, it would be easy for Robin to dwell on today's events. It was a relief to hear it genuinely didn't sound like that was the case. She hummed thoughtfully. Hmm. So, what is it then? There's there's the thing. There's the thing. I don't know. It's Robin scratched the back of his neck. He was about to elaborate when he realized something. His concern for her was still there, but he didn't feel tense anymore, as if a weight had mysteriously lifted. All he felt now was tired. Raven raised an eyebrow at him. Honestly, I have no idea. Robin said after a minute. Hmm, weird. He muttered aloud. Maybe I just needed a walk. A walk around and cure some boredom? I don't know. He looked at her again. What about you? Midnight didn't work tonight. Meditation didn't work tonight. She said, well, I can't get to sleep. So I'm doing some reading. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. She shook her head. Stop apologizing. I'm not too focused on it anyway. I was in the process of reading the same page for the emptieth time when you knocked. All the same, I'll leave you to it. Heading back to bed? Maybe. He shrugged. Maybe walk around. Maybe walk around some more. Try and figure out. He trailed off. Raven raised her eyebrow again. Robin shook his head. It's not important, just me overthinking things. At least he acknowledged your quirks. He smirked and rolled his eyes. Anyway, why do you ask? Raven sidestepped, revealing more of her doorway. Robin blinked, definitely not expecting that, and totally unsure of how to respond. Raven took in the sheer confusion and hesitation in his face. There's no sense tiring yourself out further by wandering aimlessly through the tower, she said, as if her suggestion was obvious and normal. You sure? He asked. Last I checked, no one goes in your room. And here I thought the detective in you would be dying to enter. Raven drawled. My brain is too tired and doesn't want to be in detective mode right now. He chuckled. His face grew serious again. I don't want to invade your privacy. An invitation is hardly an invasion. She crossed her arms. And you came in here anyway, when you took my spell books to make that safe room for me. Robin raised his hands up in defense. Hey, don't look at me. Beast Boy and Starfire jumped the gun and took those books before we could even think about stopping them. Sure. She rolled her eyes, a grin playing on her lips. You coming or not? He glanced at her doorway, then at her face. He was waiting to see if she was bluffing. When she continued to remain impassive, he nodded once and stepped forward. He'd seen what her room looks like from her doorway, and had also helped to do repairs on it when the tower was attacked on occasion. However, this was the first time he'd ever been casually invited inside. Make yourself at home, Raven said. She walked quietly past Robin to grab the book from her nightstand and sat down on her bed. Robin shifted on his feet a little, unsure of what to do next. Why was he even here? Because Raven let you. Because Raven let you in. He told himself. But why? Raven had the biggest day out of all of them. He couldn't imagine how physically and emotionally drained she must feel. He should be giving her space, and yet she turned around another page of her book. Raven didn't seem eager to rest, and she didn't seem to want a long time at the present time. Otherwise, she wouldn't have let him in. At the same time, she didn't feel the need to interact with him. If Robin were any other person, he would think that she was deliberately ignoring him. He knew her better than that. He knew that Raven didn't need to make conversation to be social with anyone. Sometimes sometimes simply coexisting with a person was her way of being social. For some reason tonight, in her room, she wanted company. His company. That thought alone made him feel light. He half expected her to watch him like a hawk, to make sure he wouldn't mess with anything. That was why he'd yet to move from where he stood, near her door. She turned another page, and she shifted herself to lean back against one of her pillows. Not once did she look up from her book. By allowing him into her room, she trusted him to be in her personal space. By not feeling the need to keep an eye on him while in her room, she trusted him, period. He couldn't help but smile, feeling even lighter. He let himself relax some and started walking the perimeter of her room, taking his time as he observed everything in detail for the first time. Her room didn't have a switch to turn on a bright ceiling light, which should have made things difficult to see. There were a few wrought wrought iron lanterns hanging from the ceiling instead, and his eyes gradually adjusted with that dim light. Everything was immaculate, from the lack of dust to the softness of the carpet to certain the way certain artifacts and items were arranged on their shelves. The only thing that was missing was the garbage bin next to her vanity. There appeared to be the broken remains of the candle within it. That must have been what he heard earlier. Her sweeping up broken glass. He stopped himself from asking her what happened. It would have been a stupid question. Raven took such good care of her things. Only two things could damage her belongings. Someone other than herself or her own power. He glanced at her, then back down at the pen. It was understandable. One minute she was grinning about the end, the end of the world. The next she was stopping it. He would be more surprised if she wasn't feeling emotional. He wanted to ask her out of concern, but he didn't even know what he'd ask. How are you feeling? Do you want to talk about it? Is there anything I can do to help? All those questions sounded redundant. If Raven wanted to talk about any of it, she already would have. Would she? She wasn't exactly an open book when it came to her emotions. However, with how private she was, it would probably do neither of them any good if he started prying in her in prying in any way. He shook his head and continued. The bookcase was the only other thing that couldn't be considered tidy. The shelves were stuffed full. Most books were neatly upright, whereas others were stacked on top of each other or just plain crooked. crooked. He read some of the titles on the spines, Some he recognized, but many he didn't know or were in a language he'd never seen, or were in languages he'd never seen. At some point, Raven placed her book on her lap to observe him. Robin was strolling around her room, taking his time looking at everything. She should feel agitated that someone was in her room looking at all her belongings. However, she did invite him in. She wanted 100%. She wasn't 100% sure why she'd suddenly decided to do so. But while talking in the hallway, she began feeling less and less frustrated at her powers and herself. Asking him to come in didn't seem unnatural in any way. She continued to watch him with curiosity. The same curiosity he currently had as he took everything in. He occasionally leaned down to inspect something on a desk, or stood on his tiptoes to inspect a high shelf. His arms were crossed behind his back the entire time, a seemingly casual gesture. As Robin looked at her books, his hands twitched and flexed a little, as if to reach out, but his arms stayed where they were, never deviating. Raven smiled slightly, apprehensive, appreciative that he was striving to respect her personal space. Of course, she didn't expect anything less, given how much he's always understood her. If you want to look at those books, she said, speaking up for the first time in a while, making his head wipe around to her face. Go right ahead. She lifted her book off her lap to continue reading, but if a book won't open, there's probably a reason, so don't force it. I've never seen some of these, especially the ones not in English. Robin mused. Spell books? Most, she said, setting her book down again. Some are history books or lower. Some of them are from their planets, from other planets or dimensions, but almost all of them are from Azeroth. Robin nodded. He shuffled over to a row that had mostly English titles. He saw some electric ones he didn't recognize but sounded interesting. The other ones on the shelf he was familiar with. He noted a couple things, including Harry Potter, some Neil Gaiman, and Edgar Allan Poe. Allan Poe works. Stephen King, and many others. Then I came across a book titled The Lightning Thief and picked it up with a smirk. Never would have never would have pictured you as Percy Jackson fan, he said. The humor in the first series is what drew me in. Raven said, I don't doubt that. I started reading the copy I had. It was the first book I'd read in a long time since I'm almost always busy with other things. I only got though I only got through the first couple chapters. It got ruined when Beast Boy flooded the hallway trying to make an indoor and slide, slip and slide. She nodded at the book. Borrow that one. I've read it a million times. It's worth it. Raven's smirk widened. Letting someone in your room, leading someone, lending said someone one of your books. Who are you and what have you done with Raven? Hilarious, she muttered, grinning as well. Seriously though, you sure? Yes, she nodded. I trust you, and consider it as a way of saying thank you. Raven's brows scrunched. For what? Raven rolled her eyes. Playing dumb doesn't suit you. He shook his head slowly. Raven, everything that happened today was because of you. You protected us with your powers when you weren't there. And when you were there, you stopped Trigon. We should be thanking you, not the other way around. He paused. That reminds me, Cyborg wants to have a celebratory breakfast in the morning. Raven's face was set in a grimace. You all worked so hard trying to help me. All of you were trying to defeat him every chance you got. I only came in the end. I caused Trigon. No, you didn't, he said firmly, with the book still in hand. He walked over and sat next to her on the bed. He had no control over anything. Trigon was going to happen, whether we liked it or not. She looked away from him, squeezing her eyes shut. No control, she muttered, clenching her fists. And then he regained it. Robin said, craning his neck to look at her face. You found a way to control the fight, to control your destiny. You stopped him. She relaxed her face a little. When she opened her eyes, she saw him, inches from her face, and smiling. You saved us, he muttered. He murmured, thank you. Raven almost looked away again, not believing for a second that she deserved it. But Robin's conviction stopped her, to a point where she couldn't look away from his face, from his warm smile. Not knowing how to respond, you're welcome would have only sounded curt. She simply sighed and nodded. I'll gladly borrow this. Robin brandished the book, but only if you want me to, not because of some obligation you feel. She nodded again. It wasn't just an obligation. I really do trust you. I trust you too, he said, crossing his legs on the comforter and opening the book. Always have, always will. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, trying to gog her. For many seconds she sat upright, shoulders hunched, an expression and an ex, and expression contemplative. Then she closed her eyes and let out a long sigh. When she opened her eyes again, she pushed herself backwards until her back met the pillow again. Silently, she opened her book and continued reading. Robin finally took his attention away from her to focus on his own book. It would take time for Raven to start feeling normal again, though he wished he could be of more comfort. Still, his words did seem to get through to her. Perhaps that was enough for her for now. It should have startled him how it was to sit next to her on her bed, in her room, reading one of her books. It should have startled him how natural this whole situation felt. Instead of dissecting it like a detective, he relaxed into it. He was right when he said he was right when he said he was too tired to overthink anything tonight, and it's in it And in that moment, he was all too happy about that. For what felt like hours, Robin and Raven sat on her bed, reading from their respective books. It was in the middle of the capture the flag chapter when his eyes started drooping. He was yawning by the time the chapter was finished. He tried to keep reading, wanting the peaceful atmosphere to last as long as possible. You know, yawning is normally a surefire sign that someone needs sleep. She set her book aside. Maybe I ought to, maybe I ought to go and get some rest. Memorizing what page he was on, he closed the book and stretched his arms above his head with a groan. Kicking me out already? He asked with a smirk. Not intentionally, she said, but I need sleep too. especially if Cyborg really does want to make a whole production of our breakfast. I guess you're right. He stood up, book in hand. Did you ever figure out why you couldn't get to sleep tonight? Robin shook his head. No, but I'm glad it resulted in us hanging out. He smiled. What about you? The question escaped before he could stop it. Raven's relaxed expression was gone, replaced by something more neutral. I'd rather not talk about it. It's not even important. Robin opened his mouth to say he doubted that was the case. But Raven continued. But I'm glad as well. She said quietly, now smiling also. Robin looked at the book in his hand and then at her again. Good night, Raven, he said as he walked out. Night, Robin, she said as the door closed behind. They both went to sleep that night. This time neither of them struggled to rest, both feeling perfectly content. When morning came, Raven woke with a yawn and a stretch. She put on her cloak and walked towards her door, ready to endorse Cyborg as unusual. I am a morning person, and I am obsessed with breakfast routine. She knew breakfast was going to be even more energized, given that they wanted to celebrate the world being saved. She was more than ready, and she could possibly be persuaded into admitting she was looking forward to it. She had yet to leave her doorway. Sitting in the hallway in front of her door was a white candle. She stared at it for a long second, unsure if she somehow managed to conjure a new candle in her sleep. Tilting her head confusedly, she picked it up. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. When it was up close, she recognized it as one of the candles they kept with their emergency supplies in case of a power outrage. A folded piece of paper was taped to its lid. She removed and opened it. I walked past of I walked past one of our emergency supplies closets on my way back to my room last night. I remember we had these. Obviously, it can't replace the one, and it may not even be useful to you. Just thought you could have it until you get a new one, in case you needed it. Robin, oh, thanks for letting me borrow the book. Raven stared at the note, and then at the candle. Of course, even sleep deprived, he was observant enough to notice the broken candle in the trash bin. But she certainly wasn't expecting this. Candle and note in hand, she went back in her room. After a few seconds, she left for breakfast. Raven usually kept all her candles on her vanity shelves and in her storage trunk. This particular candle took up permanent residence on her nightstand, with Robin's note folded neatly and placed beneath it. Thank you for listening to this read. I am really sorry for the mistakes I made. It's maybe because there is some mistakes, grammatical mistakes and spelling in this fanfic. I hope you enjoyed it. And please be tuned for more. Subscribe and ring the bell to receive more videos from me. See you soon.